Welcome to Moment of Truth with Amy Chen Mills. I'm hosting today Meilin Obinata. Our guest is Malcolm Harris, a freelance writer, author of multiple books, including Palo Alto. I have the hard copy, which I purchased in Kepler's, which is a bookstore in Menlo Park. I'll read the full title. History of California Capitalism in the World. We played Radiohead's Palo Alto in honor of Malcolm Harris, a native son of Palo Alto and someone who was actually born in Santa Cruz. So welcome, Malcolm Harris. Thank you so much for being on KSQD today.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to ask you to be here is that I think you wrote this book for me personally, just me, just only me, only as someone who has known about Silicon Valley and been adjacent to Silicon Valley. So I thought I wanted to thank you for writing it. I want to start off with maybe asking your favorite memory of Santa Cruz. I can't resist because we are literally in Santa Cruz, not just the county, but we are in the city of Santa Cruz right here in the studio. Do you remember anything about Santa Cruz? I think you were born here until you were about 7 or 8.
I was born in Santa Cruz and only lived there for a couple months. I was born in UC Santa Cruz, married student housing.
Oh, so okay. Okay.
Yeah, it was a couple weeks after my dad's last final at Santa Cruz.
Okay, so you breathe some of the air from the redwood trees in UC Santa Cruz, but I'll just make up stories about you.
I said you wouldn't be the first,
Okay. So one of the things, I guess that sort of connects with our show from the previous hour was, I guess, something about the Project 2025 agenda called out to me. It kind of reminded me of Larry Ellison of Oracle, his offer in the mid-90s to make a national database. And I happened to see it on Project 2025, and I thought, wow, the past never dies. So I'm just wondering, maybe we could just open with that a bit of information, because I guess at the time that offer was just too cutting edge.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of Palo Alto stories in the news today and the past week, a lot of them around the Trump campaign and the candidacy. I'm sure we'll get to a few of them. But this one, Larry Ellison's reaction. Larry Ellison's the founder of Oracle, which is a firm that does a lot of database hosting. It's the largest database contractor for the intelligence community, for the U.S. government. It started as a CIA contract that spun out into this database company, and it's led by this famously eccentric billionaire named Larry Ellison. And Larry Ellison, in the early days, right after 9/11, came out really hard. He saw the opportunity immediately and was like, let me make a national ID system. And this is something I write about, that people had been resisting for as long as there had been computers, basically. Mm-hmm. That specter of a national ID system, a coordinated, coherent national identification system, which we've managed to avoid in all the decades since computers came out. There is no centralized database of people in the United States. It does not exist. But that was Larry Ellison's first response to September 11th, was to spin up not only a department that was going to be doing security stuff in relating to terrorist attacks and disasters. But he immediately starts pushing for this national ID card. The idea is that it would be optional for citizens and mandatory for everyone else.
So when you heard about the Real ID, was that sort of presaging, or rather, is that sort of a follow-on? I guess there's so many versions of that idea, so to speak.
Well, Real ID is a good example of the inability of the authorities to establish any of these kind of centralized database, because Real ID still hasn't happened, right? They say every time, they say, oh, we're going to start doing it. But the idea of violating someone's ID, of saying this ID isn't ID enough, we still have a state-based system for IDs. We do not have a national identification system for people in this country. much to the chagrin of Larry Ellison, who could make a bunch of money hosting and controlling such systems. And he's taken a real far right turn in the last few years. He's gone on to do fund Trump election denial stuff. He's a big supporter, and really is one of the richest men in the world. He doesn't get the same headlines as an Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg these days. He used to. He was one of those guys maybe 25 years ago. 25 years ago. It's hard to remember what was late 90s and what was early 2000s, but he was one of that generation of eccentric tech CEO types. He was famously a Japanophile.
Oh my goodness,
goofy dude. Yeah.
Was he copying Steve Jobs, or was that his own thing?
I think he was really, those two guys came to it sort of independently. I mean, I'm interested in how that, if you want to get conspiratorial and look at the history and the real long world history that I write about, Larry Ellison's Oracle spins out of a company called Ampex. That was one of the first Silicon Valley companies. And that was a World War II, post-World War II company that had a lot of connections to the Japanese electronics industry that during the occupation of Japan by the United States, Ampex becomes very important, partly through its associations with the pseudo-imperial clique that's running Japan on behalf of the United States. So there are all sorts of weird connections in the book. I've heard some complaints that it's not quite conspiratorial enough, but that's only because California history is just full of so many weird stories.
You get to take your pick. Well, one of the things that struck me reading it, or rather after I completed it, is that every problem that we have so-called in California today, you've addressed it, or rather it appears in Palo Alto in some form. So I thought I would kind of go down a laundry list of some hot issues like eugenics. This tension between the ethos of ethnic studies versus the beliefs that founded or were existing at the time of the founding Stanford University, that sort of fever for eugenics. So could you talk about the tension between those things? And how? And obviously we solved them, right? It's 2024. We're over it now. But that's one of the things that sort of struck me about the book, is that you're laying out, or rather the history reveals kind of inherent tensions. But maybe start off with eugenics versus ethnic studies.
Yeah, and even before ethnic studies, just national liberation, decolonization, that from the beginning, really the beginning of Anglo presence in California, which is in Alta California, which is sort of how I structure the book. That's where I start, is with more or less the gold rush in the 1840s. Palo Alto isn't formally founded until a little bit later, but that's really the genesis of this period. And from the beginning, racial division is this really useful tool for Anglo settlers. And with the founding of Stanford University, really only a handful of decades after the gold rush, so in the early 1890s, that Leland Stanford Junior University becomes founded in Palo Alto, California. The founder of the university is Leland Stanford, obviously, and his wife, Jane Stanford. But the first president of the university, David Starr Jordan, really directs the path of the school, and with it, the path of the town. And David Starr Jordan was not just a eugenicist, he was the eugenicist. He's representing the United States at international eugenics conferences and writing eugenic theory. And at the time, this was considered, cutting edge science by some people, obviously not all people, considered the study of racial difference to be scientific. But the Stanfords did. And so David Starr Jordan presented himself as a very modern scientific person. And he brought in a bunch of faculty. He created his own subject called bionomics that I write about at length in the book. But if you look at bionomics and you read about what he was saying about how you can understand all of society, everything through this competition between groups, which he understood as competition between racial groups within the human species. this idea just persists throughout the entire story. So yeah, you still have eugenicists, someone like William Shockley Jr., who's one of those famous tech inventors. He's considered the godfather of Silicon Valley for inventing the transistor. And he's a, like, again, hardcore eugenicist, not just a eugenicist, but a world leader of eugenicist thought into like the late decades of the 20th century. So you go from the beginning of the end of the 19th century through 100 years to the end of the 20th century, excuse me, and you've got the same eugenic thought really animating Palo Alto and the environs. It becomes this like beacon for eugenic thought, and continues to be today when you listen to people like Elon Musk, who clearly has a like very specific eugenic plan involving his own genes. But Shockley was saying the same thing. This was a guy who famously like wanted to start a genius sperm bank, and if you like pitched that idea to Elon Musk tomorrow, I bet you'd get $1 million, right? And I think it's funny that these guys like don't know their own history at all. Like Elon Musk, I bet, has no idea, even though he's supposed to be a like tech guy who knows everything about tech. Probably no idea that Shockley was doing this exact same thing.
Maybe he doesn't know how to use Google. It's like sad.
Well, God knows they're not reading my books.
Okay. So one of the things that I guess surprised me was to see you credit ethnic studies historians in the writing of the book. I think it's in a footnote, and you have a ton of footnotes in this book. People out there who love footnotes love this book. So one of them, you identify the fact that it would have been impossible for you to write this without those historians. Why is that?
Well, some of them identify as historians, but none of them, all of them do. And I write about the ethnic studies movement out of San Francisco State and other California universities, but San Francisco State is the one that's really credited with leading the emergence of the subject field. But Chicano studies, women's studies, African American studies, Native studies, this is where a lot of the best work over the past 20 plus years about the Bay Area, about Palo Alto, about California is being done, is in these subject fields. And that's not a coincidence. These are the same scholars who fought for their ability to do this kind of scholarship, succeeded in the 60s and 70s in this struggle, at least to carve out a space for themselves for a time to do this kind of work. And then many of them really, really did an excellent job and revealed histories, I think, and found histories and shared histories that until now, until very recently, we didn't have access to. And so a lot of the sources that I was using, even though I'm writing about the 19th century, the 20th century, things that have been known and part of the historical record from a long time, but so many of my sources are very recent, and it's because they're coming at that history from these angles that they had to struggle to create access to. And I'm totally, standing on their shoulders. I can't credit them enough. I've got footnotes and endnotes. That's how much I can't credit them enough.
Right.
I got to put credit everywhere.
Right.
And inline citations. I tried not to be too citation heavy, but at the same time, I'm in awe of their work and some of their work, and so I want to be clear, like, how I'm able to do this work. It's not because I'm like, so special and this just jumped out of my head. It's because we've had the like historical evolution through struggle of the approach to this subject, and I'm benefiting from it, and as are all my readers.
Sorry, I just want to flex here. Unlike, I think it was, I won't say the name, but I was reading an interview of Malcolm Harris, and someone confessed that they didn't finish his book. So yeah, dear audience, I did. So there you go. But anyway, so we were talking about ethnic studies and the recency of the source material for Malcolm Harris. I also happened to catch you in I think it was a KQED piece in which you mentioned that this inadvertently became something of Asian American history that was an unintentional through line. And okay, just by the way, I'm Asian American, and I didn't think that was your intention. There were a lot of different people in there, but yeah, could you Could you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, it was sort of a joke when we were trying to figure out how to categorize the book. It ended up, I think, under just history or whatever. But as I was looking at the book and really looking what it is overall, and how much of a role that Asian American studies scholars and their work play in this book, I was thinking like you could put it under that category, you could put it under a bunch of different categories, and I think it would make sense. And I would hope people like who are doing Asian American studies, pursuing that line of study, that orientation towards historical inquiry, find this book useful. I would hope that they would. And so it's not like disciplinarily aligned perhaps with best practices of Asian American studies. Maybe Asian American studies scholars would be like, you didn't cite this, you didn't cite that, if that's how I was trying to categorize it. But I think you can like learn a lot about the history of Asian America through the history of California, through the history of the Bay Area, and through the history of Palo Alto specifically. And writing that history and writing it well, I think, it's unavoidable. And so it's kind of mind-blowing to me how little Asian American history there is in so many different histories of the Bay Area, that so many of them are very like business focused, but not just the tech industry as a whole, really just like the leadership of the tech industry, which tended to be not just like men, but very specifically white California men who are leading these companies. And so they're the ones that get their faces on the cover of the books about Bay Area history, even though that's not necessarily where the story is, I don't think.
So, yeah, I remember seeing, it just kind of jumped out at me, the not only imperial, say, the people who were in support of Imperial Japan, but also the ones who were against Imperial Japan, and you'd see this imperialists and anti-imperialists of various nations, including parts of Asia, in California well over 100 years ago. And it was just shocking to see that, because that's not how I perceive the Bay Area as this, I guess, in the sort of pre-Stanford University or sort of early Stanford University, it's sort of this cauldron, this like passionate cauldron of competing forces. So I thought it was, just as a reader, it's just completely shocking in effect.
So cool too. I mean, like they really should do like an HBO series or something.
Really?
You have
there
like
could be
all
such
of these,
like a soap opera.
because you got the East Indian anti-imperial movement, you've got the like Japanese anti-imperial movement, you've got the Korean anti-imperial movement, like you got Chinese anti-imperialists, right? Like Sun Yat-sen's son is at Berkeley. And these people are all like meeting together, going off and starting a communist party in Mexico, like going to Moscow. But California as somewhere, especially Northern California, under David Starr, in Palo Alto under David Starr Jordan, who was an anti-imperialist because he was so racist.
Right.
Such a bizarre like political position to inhabit.
Right.
And it sort of got away from him at a certain point when like anti-imperialism turned into like internationalism and turned into like a left-wing dynamic, and international terrorism started, and there were all like things that he did not want being
the unintentional
out of
consequences.
Yeah, but his like, for David Starr Jordan, who thought that like imperialism was unnatural because you shouldn't be like race mixing within your polities or whatever, was happy enough to have people who were fighting against the British Empire take refuge in California. And so you had like people who were fighting against the British Empire hiding in California as somewhere in the world that was like, the hinterland, right? You can like go to California and change your name. You can go to California and like escape the international spies who are looking for you. That's the idea. But there are like pretty outstanding stories of anti-imperialist organizing within Northern California during this period you're talking about, the early 20th century, late 19th century. And I was surprised to find a lot of that, especially some of that stuff that's like concentrated within Palo Alto proper. I had no idea.
And just going back to that idea of applying your book to the problems Californians have today, one of the things I think you mentioned in an interview was that Silicon Valley has this habit of forgetting. Right. So it's sort of this idea of making a history about Silicon Valley is antithetical to this habit of forgetting. I was talking to someone about SCO, which used to be based. So, by the way, Santa Cruz operation made a very popular flavor of Unix. I think it's called Xenix. And when I told her, she said, "Wait, I thought it was just SCO. I didn't." She never knew what it stood for, even though she was a Santa Cruz native. So that the idea of writing a history of Silicon Valley, it's sort of, you're fighting that habit of forgetting. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I think if you're always promising something new, something that no one's ever heard of, you're always selling something as a invention that just emerged fully formed from your head, I think you become sort of allergic to history, right? You can't know your history and be convinced that you're constantly doing novelty, because you'll see over and over patterns, right? You'll understand what you're doing. And I think Silicon Valley finds it much more, if not profitable, at least rewarding, let's say, to not know their own history, to not know that what they're talking about, to not know that they're doing something that's been done before, that might have been done even like relatively recently, right? And it's funny seeing like when people were talking about the metaverse and hyping the metaverse and seeing like this is at best the same sort of really goofy hype that you saw around the .com boom, where it was like everyone has to like register all the web addresses because there's a land rush on the web addresses, and that itself was based on previous land rushes that go all the way back to the mid 19th century gold rush in the first place. And so you just like keep over and over repeating these emotions, too much success. And so as long as you don't remember what it is you're doing, you can do it successfully. But as soon as you actually like learn some of that history, it dispels a lot of the like excitement, I think, about what's happening in Silicon Valley and the tech industry, capital T. And so that forgetting is very rewarding. And so I think they'll keep doing that, right? It doesn't reward people for remembering past failures. If that's how Silicon Valley worked, right? Like look at like Chewy.com, right? What was the most notorious failure of the .com boom was Pets.com. Mm-hmm. And everyone, like Harvard Business School studies saying like, this was the stupidest idea ever. This is like contrary to capitalism. This will never happen. It was like absolute folly. No one will attempt this ever again. And then it's like 15 years down the line, they're like, oh yeah, let's do that. Let's deliver dog food, and give me $1 billion. I want to deliver dog food. And someone says, yeah, that sounds good, and it's not that they're foolish for not remembering their past, is that they understand that constant forgetting is rewarding.
There's a payoff.
There is. And the people who win are not the people who remember and act prudently, right? If you're someone who looked at the .com boom, or who grew up around when I did or before, and, who was around the Bay Area at the time when I was growing up in the 2000s, and you say like, look, I'm not going to invest in any of these companies unless they've got a real like business plan and a plan to make like operational profits, and they're going to like manufacture something. Like, I'm not going to invest in any of these like floofy internet idea companies. Like, the time for that is over, right? You just lost all your money. Like, everyone made all of their money on those floofy internet companies, right? Amazon.com was a .com company. They barely scraped through the crash because they were a little bit better with like money management. But it's not because their idea was any different than anything else that anyone else was doing. And so this constant forgetting is selected for within the environment. And so I don't think we're going to see the end of it.
Okay. There are two ideas that I learned about through your book. One was the associative state, and then the other was bifurcation. Could you explain those things?
I can do my best.
Okay.
So the associative state is what historians, specifically historian Hawley, I believe, is labeled the Herbert Hoover's administrative strategy. And Herbert Hoover, for people who don't know, was president of the United States. He was the first Secretary of Commerce before that. And before that, he was the most celebrated alumni of Stanford University. He was in the 1891 first class at Stanford University. So he met Leland Stanford. And he becomes a mining engineer. He goes around the world sort of working for all these imperialist firms who want to do mining, whether it's in Peru or Myanmar or China or Russia, South Africa, anywhere there's gold or coal or other stuff for Europeans to extract. They wanted California mining engineers on the ground directing it. And Herbert Hoover was among the most celebrated California mining engineers. And so he was the first, California star Stanford engineer.
I think he called him in an interview. He was like the son of Stanford University who survived.
Yeah, he really was Leland Stanford Jr. He assumes the social role of Leland Stanford Jr., who is the son of Leland and Jane, who dies tragically as a young teenager, and for whom the school is named. And in that first class, they find Herbert Hoover. They find their man. And the Stanford administration, works really hard to push him out as a representative of the school. And they publish all these articles saying he's the highest paid, youngest engineer in the world, the exact same kind of fluff we still get about Stanford engineers today. It was there from the absolute very beginning, and Herbert Hoover was the most successful example. And when he gets into office, he has this way of running things that is really based on his experience at Stanford University and in this milieu of the Bay Area capitalists, which is Hawley calls the associative state, which is the idea is that it's not the government's job to regulate capitalists, it's the government's job to organize capitalists and help them figure out things in their common interest. And so what the government can do is, for example, divvy up the radio spectrum. It can help the radio companies share the spectrum so that they're not interfering with each other. So that's one thing that the Commerce Department does. It can set out the standards for the airplane industry, which is another thing Hoover does at Commerce. It can help organize the agricultural cartels, which is something very important that he does, and he himself is a member of the agricultural cartels as well as a farmer in California, which I read about. And so he does a number of these things as this first Secretary of Commerce really takes upon himself to organize these nascent industries in America, and then as president follows the same strategy of association. One of the big ones, and we talk about current problems and current hot button issues in California, is he helps design the first model zoning legislation and creates basically zoning with the real estate industry. So he gathers a bunch of interested stakeholders in the real estate industry, and together they come up with this model zoning practice that has been, and as well as a logic to legally defend this practice of zoning that they're basically inventing, which is that they say it's a police power. And that foundation for zoning is still the foundation for zoning today. That's still the model zoning law put together by Herbert Hoover, first son of Stanford University.
I was reading a reaction to your book, and I can't remember, I'm paraphrasing, but the person was just shocked reading that Jarvis, who is much maligned in California for Proposition 13, was a Hooverite.
Yep.
And in Santa Cruz County and Monterey County, real estate value is always a super hot issue. So Malcolm was just explaining how Herbert Hoover is basically the architect of everything, including zoning law in California. And I had just shared that a reader was surprised to learn that Jarvis, who is credited with the Proposition 13 in California, which is the bane of many a person's existence, was a Hooverite working on the Hoover campaign. And going to the concept of bifurcation, one of the things that shocked me in reading your book was that the idea of splitting the working class into renters versus homeowners, that was a Hoover, that's something that, that's a huge thing today. That's a huge thing in all over California. Could you touch on that a bit?
Absolutely, and it was really designed again by Hoover and the real estate industry within the associative state, which doesn't mean it doesn't also originate elsewhere, right? Like that's the origin of settler politics in general, is like stealing land and offering one group of non-owners the chance to steal someone else's land and become owners. So it's not like Hoover invented becoming a settler, although he was very, very adept at it, very experienced in being a settler and working at settlements and being an imperialist. But absolutely was looking at the country and saying renters cause problems, homeowners don't cause problems. We want people to feel like part of the ruling class as opposed to part of the working class. And you got to understand, this was in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution, which deeply, deeply affected Hoover. He had close relationships with members of the Romanov family, with the Russian imperial ruling class, and he watched that class get liquidated, straight up get liquidated, which included some of his resources, interests in various Russian imperial projects, again get liquidated by the Bolshevik Revolution. You have the threat of the Mexican Revolution. You have the Boxer Uprising, which he happened to be present for in China. By being an imperialist, he is also quite acquainted with anti-imperialist action, and rightly afraid of it. And as someone who spent his formative years not in the United States, but around the world at hot points of class conflict, he never thought that the United States was exempt from these patterns of world history. And he spent the last years of his life really building a bulwark against communism in the United States very, very explicitly. And that bulwark is still part of the right wing in the United States today, really an important part of it, I'd say.
I was really shocked that I would kind of read the book and think, well, how is Harris going to tie this back to Palo Alto? There's just no way. There's no way. We're going nowhere. We're over here, we're over there, we're in some other country, we're in another part of the United States, and bam, we would be right back in Palo Alto somehow. And one of those lightning points was, of course, the Hoover Institution. And I'm just going to say it. I don't think, hey, people, if this is a spoiler alert, I'm sorry, Malcolm, but just reading how Reagan and George Bush Jr. had to visit to kind of kiss the ring at Hoover on the Stanford campus, that just made my jaw drop, because I thought, oh, okay, what is it like to make an institution which lasts long after your death, to make it so somebody in Texas running for governor has to, somebody has to look you up and down and say, yeah, he's all right. He's all right. And that's even if you are in kind of the political aristocracy of this country, somebody had to look George Bush Jr. up and down. So that I found completely shocking.
Yeah, that someone who's George Shultz, right? It's not it's not a secret person. It's someone whose old house is still on the campus, right? And it's funny that he will forever be associated with Theranos now, because he got played by Elizabeth Holmes, and so is now indelibly associated with that fraud. And people don't know that he was most important person in the country for many years or whatever.
Oh, there's that too. There's that. That's
but I think that history is less well known. And yeah, he really was the kingmaker both for Reagan and Bush Jr. And you don't think of Stanford University as the center of power for the Republican Party or whatever. But it really has been, and it provided a lot of staffers for those administrations. I mean, Condoleezza Rice famously was provost of the university, of Stanford University, and comes to play a very important, cabinet role as national
people from
security
Gilead.
advisor. Yeah, absolutely. Rumsfeld is a Silicon Valley guy in some ways, as are a lot of these folks. And so Silicon Valley from way back through Hoover, who doesn't die until the 60s. So his arms stretch a real long time. We think in the American story conventionally, Hoover disappears, he vanishes like he's the Wicked Witch of the West or whatever once he loses to FDR. But Hoover outlives FDR by many, many years, by decades, and he continues to have an important, really influential role on the country, even as he never holds public office again.
I wanted to turn to some design decisions you did in the construction of this book. You've told the story of kind of when you decided that you can't just write about yourself growing up in the bosom of Palo Alto, but that it's some kind of global story. But what was it? What experience made you realize, this is global in nature?
Yeah, I think from the beginning I wanted to tell a world historical story, because my idea was that, Palo Alto was a world historically important place.
Was there a particular aspect of your research that sort of struck you over the head? I
mean, the emergence of global capitalism in this period. So the period, Palo Alto was founded, I believe, in 1871. And that's in 1870s are a very important period in world systems thinking. This is where the world system really comes from. And California is really this last link in the chain of the capitalist world system, along with Australia, China, Japan, that links these two continents into one full system. And California is sort of last to get added, right? The fact that it's being colonized in the mid 19th century from a place where it's very loosely colonized at that point. There are a bunch of colonial powers, none of which has really got a firm anchor in Alta California at that point. The Spanish colonization was really sparse in the missions. The French had been looking, the Russians had been looking, a lot of people the British have the Northwest Territories, but it's really sparsely colonized, and it goes very quickly from being the furthest, least colonized place in this world system to being the real center of a new world system. And that was my theory. And so as I began researching, I found oh my gosh, this is way truer than I thought. I thought everyone was going to be yelling at me. All the reviews were going to be oh, you think Palo Alto is so important just because you grew up there. Mm-hmm. But it's not, clearly you mean San Francisco or something.
Right.
You've attributed false importance to this place because it's important to you. And by the time the book came out, I think I was thinking that while I was writing it.
Okay.
2020, that I thought was going to get that kind of criticism. And just in those years, between then and when it came out, the role of Palo Alto and Silicon Valley within the world changed so much that by the time it came out, everyone was yes, of course, Palo Alto, one of the most important places in the world.
Why'd you work so hard?
Yeah,
it's so obvious.
Yeah, definitely, it's a good idea to have this book. It totally makes sense. And so I was gratified not to have to argue for my subject itself at that point. Because I think world history, not just at the beginning of the story where I'm talking about these anti-imperial currents and we're talking about the settlement of the West, but also, in the 60s where I'm talking about anti-colonial struggle, not just in California, but around the world. And if you think about California as a colonial territory of the United States, which I really do, I think it's America's Algeria in a lot of ways. They're both added to the country at the same time in the mid 19th century. Algeria is actually way closer to Paris than California is to Washington D.C. in the mid 19th century. And for the United States really is a like literal overseas colony. And so that from the beginning made me start thinking about California in the context of global history rather than just in the context of regional history or even national history, because I think that was the context in which it really belonged.
Another design aspect, which I thought was interesting, is the way in which you use metaphors. There's just so many that jump out at me when you refer to, I think, capitalism as like an alien wriggling, like kind of landing in California and just kind of wriggling without much other context, but pretty much fully formed. That metaphor or others. And I must confess, I have not read your other books. I don't know if you use metaphors all the time, but were you trying to hone your metaphors as like a teaching tool for the reader?
Yeah, I use metaphorical language a lot. I like metaphors. I write for the general public audience. I'm not an academic. I don't have an advanced degree. I try to write well. That's the best way to communicate ideas that I have. And I think metaphors are one of those rhetorical tools that I rely on a lot, and that I think also keeps the book fun for people and keeps people thinking and engaged. Sometimes I've gotten a little criticism for going like too far with some of those extended metaphors, but I'm very careful not to mix any of them.
Okay.
So there are no
Don't
mixed
mix metaphors.
There are definitely extended metaphors in there, though. And some where I get like kind of goofy. But for me, it's kind of a game at some points to like, okay, how can I take this metaphor and not just like make one comparison, but how do I get a second comparison out of this? How do I
okay.
You're
a bargain shopper.
No, well, I have fun writing.
Okay.
And I hope that comes through to the reader. I had a really good time writing this book, and I have a good time trying to communicate and share ideas with people. I think it's not an agonized process for me. I think for some people, they think of writing as just like, oh, you gotta, what's the Bukowski line? You gotta sit down at the typewriter and just bleed. You gotta it's anguishing, and you're sitting there and you're crumpling up pages and throwing them at your trash can or whatever. And that's not how it is for me. It's a really it's hard, but it's joyful. And I think one of the places that leaks through is in my metaphors and my use of figurative language and my jokes, and I'll do some alliteration in there just for fun, and word choice, and thankfully I've got a good editor who tries to keep me under control, so I'm not just Grateful Dead just doodling out there.
Sure.
For my own entertainment, I try to keep it about the reader and really communicating ideas and stuff. But I hope we all have a good time here. It's a long book.
Honestly, it's a rollicking ride to read. So that's why I wanted to just ask you about that. I also noticed that with the many, 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 many footnotes, some of your sources are quite recent. So I was thinking, okay, how do you write a book? And you're researching. I understand researching stuff that's decades old or 10 years old, or basically sources which are established long before you start writing. But I think some of your sources are from 2021, when I'm sure you already started writing. So I'm wondering, how did you manage that process of tracking what was or wasn't available to you?
It's hard. I mean, so Richard White's book, Who Killed Jane Stanford, came out after I had written that section of my book, for example. And so I was oh shoot, this guy's, written an extremely detailed researched account of this somewhat sketchy historical event that I had to interpret out of the primary sources, because, primary sources and secondary sources, the writing of history is not as set in stone as people might imagine. There's all sorts of contradictions out there in the record that historians are asked to contend with every time they're trying to deal with something. And so to have someone come out and say, I've got a definitive account of this sketchy event that you've been trying to suss out, then I had to go, download the ebook, read it as fast as I can, try and figure out okay, does this contradict anything that I've said? How, why, in what way? How do I deal with that? And there weren't too many of those situations. But that was definitely a memorable one. But for some of the stuff, like Benjamin Madley's book, An American Genocide, which is about the genocide of California's indigenous people, and it does a really good job giving like very detailed, week by week, person by person accounts of this genocide. Is a very recent book, and until that book came out, there are a couple other texts, and I read them. But it's like California history is actually really short relative to American history.
Okay.
Which is the like, larger subject field in which it's integrated. Just like time-wise, if you think about Anglo-American history is like 150 years, give or take, and Anglo-American history itself is like 400 years, give or take. So...
are you saying you have a shorter span of time? So
yeah.
You felt the research process was not as onerous?
I think it was. It was much more manageable. I couldn't have written a book about the entire history of Boston, for example.
Okay.
Just couldn't have done it.
Right.
It's just like the history is too much longer. Whereas when you're writing a history about Alta California from an Anglo-American perspective, and you're not going back, and I didn't go back to the Spanish period and before that really, you're really dealing with 150, 170 years of history, it's a lot, and my book's long, but mine is the first one that goes all the way through all of that history step by step without jumping from, the gold rush, and that's a metaphor for computers, and so we're going to talk about computers.
And so one other design question I have is that you draw these unknown heroes, and you draw them beautifully, and you care for these people just as much as if they were the famous people like Ernesto Galarza. And I'm just wondering how much detail would you put into that description so that you're arming the reader, and yet, right, it still has to fit within this like 700-page book.
Yeah, and I don't want people to think I'm writing history as a history of like people's personal stories, because that's not really how I see these stories. These are like, characters who represent things that are larger than themselves.
Forces, not men, right?
Exactly. The forces, not men. And that's a line from a book that I'm quoting, a fictional book from early California called The Octopus. And that was really a like guiding instruction for me as I was writing it, both writing about like the ruling class characters that I'm doing, whether it's David Packard or Leland Stanford or William Shockley, but also the like working class heroes that you're talking about, where it's Carl Yoneda, Ernesto Galarza, Tim Yohannan, who is like a like punk East Bay punk organizer. Those stories really excited me. I was really excited to learn them and share them with other people. Har Dayal, the East Indian anti-imperialist, is another great one. And so I was really excited to like learn about these characters, and really excited then to share them with readers, as well as do my part in building up the historical record a little bit. And there are parts in the book where I'll like list more names than I think the reader feels are necessary. And that was very intentional for me, which is that like when I was doing research between books, Crackdowns, for example, is a guy's name. That's like a hyperlink that allows you to like find a source, right? If you're searching through text by someone's name, being like, I want to know more about this person. I was doing my best to try and link my book to those histories through those people.
Well, Malcolm, we are wrapping up with you, but I had tons of questions, but is there something that you wanted to share with us that maybe I didn't have a chance to ask you?
Yeah, I think one thing that people should be on the lookout for right now is VC money going into fascist politics, and that's not a new thing of Silicon Valley money supporting fascist politics, but people are going to become familiar with some new names soon if they're paying attention, whether it's someone like Joe Lonsdale or David Sachs. And these are people who are like mid-range winners in the Silicon Valley sweepstakes, who are out there really trying to shape the world that the rest of us live in very intentionally, and really for the worse for the most of the rest of us. And so Palo Alto, the history that I'm telling is very much like still accelerating. And you can find out about those people in this book in the later chapters, but it's worth going through the early chapters to really put them in their context, because I think you can understand them a lot better if you do.
Right. I know you have a new book as well. Are you done?
That's right.
Yes.
I'm almost done with the edits.
Okay.
Yes, it should be out in next April.
Okay.
And I'll come back here and promote it. But,
okay.
The title right now is What's Left? 3 Paths Through the Planetary Crisis.
Nice. Thank you so much for joining us. That was Malcolm Harris, author of the book Palo Alto, A History of California, Capitalism, and the World. He was so generous to join us in the Chaos Giddy Moment of Truth with Amy Chen Mills show. Amy Chen Mills' Moment of Truth team includes Todd Zimmerman, Vararara Krishnan, Nyako Nyasu, and myself, Meilin Obinata, and also Joy Schendeldecker. I was thrilled to have this conversation with Malcolm Harris and immerse everybody in that book. Thanks for joining us.